Wild animals do not negotiate. Across forests, deserts, and mountains, one rule has always remained true. When threatened, wildlife responds on instinct. Venomous snakes do not understand symbolism. They do not recognize devotion. They strike because that is what they were designed to do. For centuries, humans have stepped into the wild believing they could control it, tame it, command it, even use it to prove something greater than themselves. But nature has a way of reminding us who truly holds the power. On May 27, 2012, just after 3 p.m., in Panther State Forest near Bluefield, West Virginia, that reminder came with fangs. It was Memorial Day weekend. Families gathered under the open Appalachian sky for a Pentecostal worship service unlike most others in America. At the center stood 44-year-old pastor Mack Wolford, confident, passionate, and unwavering in his belief. To him, this wasn't recklessness, it was obedience. Raised in a lineage of serpent-handling preachers, Wolford had seen the risks firsthand. In 1983, when Mack was just 15 years old, his father died from a snakebite during a similar service. Many would have walked away from the practice forever. Mack did the opposite. He embraced it. By 2012, he had become one of the most visible defenders of snake handling in America, even appearing on the National Geographic series Snake Salvation. He openly declared that if he were ever bitten and died, it would simply mean his time had come. That Sunday afternoon, a wooden box sat near the pulpit. Inside it, a timber rattlesnake, coiled and silent. The congregation sang, hands clapped, voices rose in worship. Faith filled the air. But so did something else, tension. Because no matter how strong the belief, no matter how sincere the prayer, one truth remains. When humans test the wild eventually answers back. And within minutes, it would. Wildlife does not bend to belief. Across history, whenever humans have attempted to dominate predators, whether for sport, ritual, or pride, the outcome has often been the same. Yet in the early 20th century, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a small but determined group of believers built a theology around confronting that very danger. Around 1910, in the mountains of Tennessee, a Pentecostal preacher named George Went Hensley, then in his early 30s, began teaching a radical interpretation of Scripture. Hensley focused on a controversial passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 17 and 18. "And these signs shall follow them that believe. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them." Most Christian denominations interpret this passage symbolically. Hensley did not. He believed it was a command, literal, immediate, and binding. To him, handling venomous snakes was not an act of spectacle, it was proof of true faith. If a believer was spiritually pure, God would protect them. If they were bitten and died, it meant their faith had faltered, or their time had come. From rural churches in Tennessee, the practice spread through isolated Appalachian communities in Kentucky, West Virginia, and parts of Alabama during the 1910s and 1920s. These were regions shaped by poverty, coal mining, tight-knit families, and a fierce independence from outside authority. Snake handling became more than a ritual. It became identity. But the risks were never theoretical. In 1955, at age 75, George Hensley himself died after being bitten by a rattlesnake during a service in Florida. His death did not end the movement. If anything, it solidified its martyr narrative. By the late 20th century, several Appalachian states had outlawed the practice, citing public safety concerns. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent. For many congregations, government restrictions were seen as persecution, further proof that their faith was under attack. To outsiders, the ritual appears reckless. To insiders, it is obedience. And that divide between devotion and danger is where the story of Mack Wolford begins to take shape. Because by 2012, this was no forgotten backwoods tradition. It was a living, breathing practice, one that had already claimed lives, including Wolford's own father. So the question becomes, when history keeps repeating itself, is it faith or fate? And how did a 44-year-old pastor in West Virginia come to believe he would be the exception to a century of deadly warnings? Nature does not remember names. It does not care about legacy. Every year across the United States, thousands are bitten by venomous snakes, not because the animals are evil, but because they are wild. When cornered, handled, or threatened, they strike. It is defense, not malice. And yet, for some, the risk is not something to avoid. It is something to embrace. Mack Wolford was born in 1967 in rural West Virginia, into a world where serpent handling wasn't fringe, it was family. By the time he could walk, he was surrounded by worshipers who believed that picking up rattlesnakes was an act of obedience to God. His father, Elder Elbert Ray Wolford, was a well-known snake-handling preacher in the region. In 1983, when Mack was just 15 years old, his father was bitten by a venomous snake during a church service in West Virginia. He refused medical treatment and died days later at age 39. For many teenagers, witnessing the death of a parent would sever any connection to the cause. For Mack, it deepened it. Friends later said he saw his father not as a victim, but as faithful. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Mack drifted in and out of ministry, at times stepping away from public serpent handling. But by the late 2000s, he returned with renewed conviction. He began leading services again, determined to preserve what he saw as a fading Appalachian tradition. In 2012, at age 44, Wolford gained national attention after appearing in the National Geographic series Snake Salvation. On camera, he spoke calmly and confidently about the risks. He acknowledged the deaths. He acknowledged the law. But he insisted the command in Scripture was clear. If God chose to protect him, he would live. If not, that too would be God's will. Those who knew him describe a charismatic preacher, warm, intense, persuasive, a father, a husband, a man who laughed easily but preached fiercely. Yet beneath that confidence was a question few dared to ask aloud. After watching his father die from the same ritual, did he ever truly believe he would be spared? Was he fearless or simply resolved? Because by May 2012, Mack Wolford was not just continuing a tradition, he was walking the same path that had already claimed his father. And in just days, he would step fully into that legacy, in a way no one in that congregation would ever forget. Wild animals follow instinct, not intention. Wildlife experts repeat the same warning every year. When humans handle wild creatures for display, pride, or control, the outcome is unpredictable. And when a rattlesnake feels threatened, it does not hesitate. May 27, 2012, Memorial Day weekend. Panther State Forest, near Bluefield, West Virginia. The outdoor service began shortly after 3 p.m. Families had gathered beneath the Appalachian sky. Folding chairs were arranged in a clearing. Scripture was read. Testimonies were shared. Worship built steadily. At 44 years old, Mack Wolford stepped forward to preach. Those present later recalled that he was energized, passionate, fully in command of the moment. This was not unusual. He had handled snakes many times before. But handling a snake is never routine. Sometime after 3:30 p.m., a timber rattlesnake was brought forward. Witnesses say Wolford reached into the container and lifted the snake confidently, gripping it behind the head, allowing its body to coil and stretch. The congregation responded with encouragement. For believers, this was proof, visible evidence of faith in action. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the balance shifted. The snake twisted. Its head snapped free. In a fraction of a second, it struck, sinking its fangs into Wolford's thigh. There was a pause. Not chaos, not immediately. Those who were there later described confusion more than panic. Some believed it was just another test. Others assumed he would shake it off, as he had before. Wolford remained composed. He did not cry out. He did not collapse. He continued speaking briefly, as if the moment could be contained by faith alone. But venom does not pause for prayer. Within minutes, the swelling began. His speech slowed. The reality of the strike settled in. Still, he refused medical attention. For decades, snake-handling pastors had held to the same conviction. Seeking hospital treatment after a bite was a lack of faith. His father, Elder Elbert Ray Wolford, had refused treatment in 1983 and died at age 39. Mack knew that history. And yet, on that Sunday afternoon in May 2012, he made the same decision. As the hours passed, his condition worsened. By that evening, he was transported, not to a hospital, but to a home in Bluefield, West Virginia. By midnight, the venom had spread beyond recovery. Just before 1 a.m. on May 28, 2012, Mack Wolford was pronounced dead at the age of 44. But the questions surrounding that afternoon did not die with him. Why did no one intervene sooner? Did he believe until the very end that he would survive? And how does a community reconcile faith when the miracle never comes? Because what happened in Panther State Forest that day was not just a tragic accident. It was the collision of belief and biology. And the fallout would ripple far beyond that clearing in the woods. When wildlife retaliates, it does so without hesitation. A rattlesnake does not calculate consequences. It reacts. And when it does, the clock begins ticking immediately. On Sunday evening, May 27, 2012, after the bite in Panther State Forest near Bluefield, West Virginia, 44-year-old Mack Wolford initially appeared calm. Witnesses later said he insisted he was fine. He reassured members of his congregation. To them, remaining composed was part of the faith. But rattlesnake venom is unforgiving. Within the first hour, swelling intensified around the bite wound on his thigh. Pain increased. His body began reacting to the toxins spreading through his bloodstream. Friends urged him to seek emergency treatment. Antivenom, if administered quickly, could have dramatically improved his chances of survival. He refused. That refusal was not impulsive, it was theological. For generations, serpent-handling believers had maintained that seeking medical help after a bite demonstrated doubt. His father, Elder Elbert Ray Wolford, had made the same choice in 1983 and died at age 39. Mack, at 44, followed the same path. By late evening, his condition deteriorated sharply. He was eventually taken from the forest to a residence in the Bluefield area rather than a hospital. As the venom continued attacking his organs, breathing became more difficult. His body weakened. Just before 1 a.m. on Monday, May 28, 2012, Mack Wolford died. News of his death spread quickly through southern West Virginia and beyond. National media outlets picked up the story within hours. For many Americans, it was shocking, even incomprehensible. For members of his church, it was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. Snake handling had long been illegal in several Appalachian states, including West Virginia. Law enforcement had historically struggled to enforce those laws, often due to the private and rural nature of the services. After Wolford's death, questions resurfaced about whether authorities should intervene more aggressively in religious practices involving dangerous wildlife. Was it a matter of public safety or religious freedom? Some critics called it preventable. Others called it persecution when outsiders questioned the practice. Within the community, grief mixed with conviction. Some believers saw his death as God's will. Others wrestled privately with doubt. The tragedy reignited a national debate, not just about snake handling, but about how far faith should extend when survival is at stake. And as the headlines faded, one question lingered in the hills of Appalachia. If the pattern has repeated itself for over a century, why does the tradition endure? To understand that, we have to look beyond the bite, into the beliefs that outlive the men who carry them. When humans repeatedly test wild animals, Experts say the outcome is rarely surprising. Herpetologists across the United States warn that venomous snakes are not unpredictable monsters. They are predictable defenders. When restrained, waved, or provoked, they strike. The danger is not spiritual, it is biological. Yet for more than a century, despite documented deaths, from George Went Hensley in 1955 at age 75 in Florida, to Elder Albert Ray Wolford in 1983 at age 39 in West Virginia, to Mack Wolford in 2012 at age 44, the ritual continues. Why? Religious scholars point first to biblical literalism. The disputed ending of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 17 to 18, includes the line, "They shall take up serpents." Most denominations interpret this passage symbolically, arguing it refers to spiritual protection. But within isolated Appalachian congregations dating back to the early 1900s in Tennessee and Kentucky, some believers adopted a strictly literal reading. For them, refusing to handle serpents would mean rejecting Scripture itself. Cultural anthropologists note that in economically challenged and geographically isolated regions of Appalachia throughout the 20th century, high-risk rituals reinforced group identity. When outside society labeled them backward or extreme, the ritual became a boundary marker, a way of saying, "We are different. We endure what you fear." Psychologists who study belief systems add another layer. When faith is threatened by law enforcement, media coverage, or public criticism, communities often double down rather than retreat. The more the outside world condemns a ritual, the more it can strengthen internal conviction. By 2012, snake handling was illegal in states such as West Virginia and Tennessee, but enforcement remained inconsistent. This created a persistent tension between religious liberty and public safety, a debate that intensified after Wolford's death. Experts also challenge how media portrays the practice. Television appearances, including the 2012 National Geographic series Snake Salvation, brought national exposure. Some argue the coverage sensationalized the danger. Others argue it simply documented an existing reality. So the deeper question becomes this: is snake handling about proving faith or expressing identity? Is risk the point or the byproduct? And when tragedy strikes, does it weaken belief or refine it? History suggests something unsettling. Despite fatalities across decades, the ritual persists, not because participants are unaware of biology, but because for them, obedience outweighs outcome. Which raises a final, uncomfortable thought. If death does not end the practice, what, if anything, will? Wildlife does not act out of anger or belief. It responds to instinct. When humans choose to test that instinct, whether out of pride, survival, or faith, nature answers the same way every time. In the early hours of May 28, 2012, after being bitten the previous afternoon in Panther State Forest near Bluefield, West Virginia, 44-year-old pastor Mack Wolford was pronounced dead. His passing did not end the practice he defended. Instead, it reignited a debate that had been simmering for decades. Snake handling had long been illegal in West Virginia and several neighboring states, yet enforcement was often minimal, partly because these services were held in remote Appalachian areas, and partly because of the sensitive line between public safety and religious freedom. After Wolford's death in 2012, lawmakers, religious leaders, and civil rights advocates revisited that line once again. Was this a matter of constitutional protection or a preventable loss of life? Within the community, reactions were deeply divided. Some saw Wolford's death as tragic but divinely ordained, a man who stood firm in his beliefs until the end. Others quietly questioned whether faith required such risk. A few congregations reconsidered public serpent handling. Others continued, determined not to let one death dismantle a tradition rooted in over a century of literal biblical interpretation dating back to George Went Hensley in the early 1910s. The forests of Appalachia remained unchanged. The mountains stood silent. But conversations inside homes and churches grew heavier. For some, this was proof of recklessness. For others, proof of unwavering faith. And before we go further, if you value thoughtful documentaries that explore complex and controversial stories with depth and respect, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes in asking difficult questions. It helps keep stories like this alive. Because this story is not only about one man, it is about belief, and what happens when belief collides with biology. Across cultures and continents, people continue to test limits in the name of conviction. Sometimes it leads to inspiration. Sometimes it leads to tragedy. But it always forces us to examine where faith ends and responsibility begins. So now, the question becomes personal. How far would you go to prove what you believe? And if the cost were life itself, would you still call it faith? The debate did not end in 2012, and somewhere in the Appalachian hills, the tradition continues.